All right, everybody, welcome to our second installment of the Lunchtime Faculty Research Presentation Series. I'm Dr. Jeff Herrick, the Director of the Research Center, and thank you all for showing up today. We truly appreciate it. A couple pieces of housekeeping. Our next presentation will be Pedro Larrea Rubio from the Department of Spanish. He'll be reading his poetry in 2 weeks from today on October 17th. If you are interested in presenting your research, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. Please feel free to write your name and email down, and we are starting to schedule for the spring and or fall this month, okay? So today I'd like to introduce Dr. Brian Cram, who's been with the university for 14 years and earned his PhD from the Rutgers University. And Dr. Cram is going to present to us some initial work on his fourth and upcoming book entitled Spy Fiction After 9/11. And notes from the John le Carrès Literary Archives. So thank you very much, Brian Cram.
Well, thank you all. I don't feel like I maybe need to do this, but just in case. So I think all of us know when we get into our research, it's always very personal, and there's a personal connection to what we do. And for me, it's not only having this author in my life as just throughout my life. The David Cornwell, John le Carrès started writing in 1960 and didn't stop until even, a book came out after he died, December 30th in 2020. So he's had a very long career, and to me, he's just sort of been more than just background noise. It's sort of been very personal. But also the topic of spy fiction after 9/11 is personal because, most of you know, I was an intelligence analyst before I was a professor, and I started my officially signed into that job on September 13th, 2001, and lasted until 2006. In fact, I was supposed to report to the Pentagon to process my paperwork on September 13th, and that did not happen. And so the backlog of my security clearance was very quickly updated, and I was put to work right away. And so why did I not stay? Part of it is, like le Carré, he also had a very brief career in the intelligence community in Britain. He left because Kim Philby exposed who he was when he betrayed most of MI6, but also because he did not like what he was doing and what he saw bothered him, and the same was for me. So I have always been fascinated by the right way to do intelligence, and also the cultural representation of what it is I supposedly did, which, it may surprise you, is not what really goes on. It would be the most boring television show or book ever. The actual working title of my book is In the Shadows, Spy Fiction and 9/11. It might be after 9/11. It might be Spytainment and 9/11. But I do like In the Shadows, and I'll tell you why and where I picked up that turn of phrase in a little bit. And so I have a working table of contents, I could say. And the first is an introduction that buys into, I think, a well-established notion that 9/11 was a great cultural rupture, and not only ruptured every part of American society, but certainly in cultural representation as well. In my previous book on Holocaust representation, I tackled that idea of a great rupture because of a traumatic event. And I think 9/11 counts as that for particularly the United States. The idea of before and after is important because I'm quoting there, and I will in the introduction, Cofer Black, who was the first head of the counter-terrorist center in the CIA right after 9/11, and he was widely known to be an incredible, aggressive, hard person, the one who really is responsible for enhanced interrogation techniques, embracing torture, assassination, and he told his group of analysts and then later operatives, moments after 9/11, within hours, he said this, all you need to know is that there's a before 9/11 and an after 9/11. And what we do is going to be in the after. And that justified really everything. So I think that's a great introduction. Some of these chapters have names. This one has a name because I'm working on it now. This is sort of the history of modern spy fiction. And by spy fiction, I'm it's actually, for me, mostly film and television, not just novels. But I do start with the history of the genre, which is literary, going back to the 19th century, actually go all the way back to John Fenimore Cooper. But in reality, it's a late 19th century British genre that remains almost purely British until after World War II. So "In the Beginning Was a Spy" is a quote from one of le Carrès' novels. The third chapter, as I see it, will be getting into the history docudrama part of spy fiction, how not only is the event itself and the aftermath recreated by Hollywood primarily, but also how they, in the same period of, say, 2003, 2009 or so many Hollywood films used historical events like the Munich massacre, Argo, about the hostage crisis in Iran, and other examples, to really talk about 9/11. Steven Spielberg's film Munich was absolutely entirely his response to 9/11, and he'll tell you as much. But also Zero Dark 30, which is about the Bin Laden operation to kill him, is really an important way of how we remember, how Hollywood and really the government wants us to remember this event, not actually how it happened. Some of these you may have seen, some of you might not have. 4, I call this, if you see a lot of, I just kind of noticed the other day, the JB here. Jack Bauer, Jason Bourne, and James Bond. What do you do with this subset of really extremely popular genre, and all of them predating 9/11? We associate 24, I think, as a post-9/11 series. Jack Bauer is the ultimate sort of vengeful character, but it actually started that fall of 2001. Half the first season was all but made before 9/11, and then the second half of the season, where they had not yet filmed it, takes a decidedly different turn, and the rest of it is all about vengeance and justifying the most extreme measures, and of course, torture was most famously. Jason Bourne as well is a Cold War creation, but he becomes a post 9/11 creation. The first film is just a year after 9/11. And James Bond, the Daniel Craig James Bond, was entirely created to be a post 9/11 James Bond, from the decision to cast him to the plotting points to all of it. And clearly, the before Bonds are not like that. The chapter 5 is what I'm speaking about today, really. That is the work I did in the Oxford Archives. And the novel I'm focusing on is Absolute Friends, which came out in 2003. He also, JLC, le Carrès, the other representative novel where he really takes on his problems with 9/11 is the 2008 book, A Most Wanted Man, which is about an extraordinary rendition. But today we'll focus on Absolute Friends. And finally, is my favorite, I think, most quintessential representation of post-9/11 spy fiction, Homeland, which ran from 2011 to 2020. And the title of that is All I See Is Damage, Homeland and the War on Terror. It's also, by the way, a series that the creators will tell you is updating le Carré for the post 9/11 age. They take all of their plot points unapologetically from him and weave it into finally a woman protagonist, which is also really interesting. So here are some of those representations. Maybe you've seen, you know, who some of these people are by now. Maya from Zero Dark 30, Carrie Matheson from Homeland, Jack Bauer, James Bond. The Looming Tower is a very excellent television show based on a journalistic book about the year or so before 9/11 and the intelligence failures that led up to it. And then we have our young Jason Bourne. So why do I call it In the Shadows? And I originally wanted to call the book, the first catchy title would be The Dark Side. And both of those things come from this very famous, as you see, September 16th, Meet the Press interview with Dick Cheney, who we all know is the real architect of the War on Terror. And he said, we needed to work on the dark side. And Jane Mayer, who's a brilliant journalist for The New Yorker, already wrote a great book about him and the War on Terror called The Dark Sides. So I picked up with In the Shadows, which is something else he noted here. And so I want to highlight the part of this interview where he's announced, because they've met several times between that Tuesday afternoon and this Sunday morning, to plan the War on Terror. And it's all been planned by this interview. And the way he is describing it is telling you what the next really 20 years are going to look like. So let me see if I might not go there. It didn't. Okay, let's go here.
Live from Camp David.
We'll start here. No.
Live from Camp David.
He's in Kenya and Tanzania, the U.S. Embassy, several hundred died. The United States launched 60 Tomahawk missiles into his training sites in Afghanistan. It only emboldened him. It only inspired him and seemed even to increase his recruitment. Is it safe to say that that kind of response is not something we're considering in that kind of minute magnitude?
I want to be careful here, Tim, because that clearly would be inappropriate for me to talk about operational matters, specific options or the kinds of activities we might undertake going forward. We do indeed, though, have, obviously, the world's finest military. They've got a broad range of capabilities, and they may well be given missions in connection with this overall task and strategy. We also have to work, though, sort of the dark side, if you will. We're going to spend time in the shadows in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies, if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in, and so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objective.
There have been restrictions placed on the United States intelligence gathering, reluctance to use unsavory characters, those who violate human rights, to assist in intelligence gathering. Will we lift some of those restrictions?
Well, I think so. I think one of the byproducts, if you will, of this tragic set of circumstances is that we'll see a very thorough sort of reassessment of how we operate and the kinds of people we deal with. If you're going to deal only with sort of officially approved, certified good guys, you're not going to find out what the bad guys are doing. You need to be able to penetrate these organizations. You need to have on the payroll some very unsavory characters if, in fact, you're going to be able to learn all that needs to be learned in order to forestall these kinds of activities. It is a mean, nasty, dangerous, dirty business out there, and we have to operate in that arena. I'm convinced we can do it. We can do it successfully, but we need to make certain that we have not tied the hands, if you will, of our intelligence communities in terms of accomplishing the mission.
These can't tie the hands of the intelligence agencies to do the mission. So having been on the ground level of that, I saw exactly, in my own indirect way, participated in that. I was someone who wrote questions that were used in interrogations of detainees at Guantanamo Bay, and I kind of lived with that every day. Did I know how they were being questioned? No, but not then. But it's kind of something that is another reason why I kind of get into this topic. So if I have a perspective, a thesis in the book so far, one of the things that drew me to frame the book as I do is from the John le Carrès novel, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy. The character of Bill Hayden, who, spoiler alert, is the traitor, but it's 1974, you can get that. He's a great character. He's kind of modeled after Kim Philby, the infamous traitor there, and he's quoting Graham Greene, another brilliant novelist that was le Carrés's mentor and close personal friends. And that character says, intelligence services are the only real measure of a nation's political health, the only real expression of its subconsciousness. To me, that says it all. And I think in this period, certainly during the War on Terror, that is very true from what I had seen and how it's really represented in culture. And so I'm asking these questions in the book in different ways with these chapters. Now, what does spy fiction reveal about a nation's culture and politics? And specifically, how does the genre's popularity influence how the national security state operates in the post-9/11 environment? And that's the difference here, because it's not like all cultural analysis is valid and great and we should do it, but in spy fiction, there's an added dimension here. Our own policymakers invoke fiction to justify real policy actions. And that happens on a number of levels. I'll now get into a little of that. By the way, this is going to be my book cover. Like, I'm getting rights to this. I want Carrie Matheson up front, and it's a publicity photo by Showtime, so I think I can do it because they want it out there anyway. This is actually the text I use in my intelligence studies class. I teach at 1 o'clock. It's called Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. It came out last year. And I love that the author really leans into this very true phenomenon we live with here. Spytainment, as she calls spy fiction, film, television, books, has ballooned in the past 20 years, becoming the predominant and often only way for Americans to understand the intelligence agencies that serve them. By necessity, that's true. We can't know we don't have clearances. We don't know the truth, and so we are relying on, oftentimes, fiction. She finds two trends that spytainment puts out there that are easily knocked down. The public often thinks the intelligence community is far more powerful and unaccountable than they actually are. My experience is that it's more Keystone Cops than, Spectre from James Bond, but I don't think that's changed. And also, because I just noted, policymakers invoke fictional spies to formulate real policy. The most infamous example is Jack Bauer. Everyone from Anton Scalia to President Bush to President Clinton have actually said, well, Jack Bauer needs to be able to do his job, and we need to give him every tool he can. And if torture works like it does for him, this Anton Scalia as Supreme Court Justice, went before the lawyers, equivalent of the MDA, but for lawyers, basically said, I'm not going to be the person to tie Jack Bauer's hands, and if we need to do enhanced interrogation, then let's go all in with it. And he's quoting Jack Bauer, and beyond that, the US military itself traveled to Hollywood to meet with the producers of 24 and said, stop putting torture in so often in the show because we have not enough training on interrogation, and they're literally sitting there in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, where the official report in Abu Ghraib showed that they were watching 24 and practicing it on detainees. That's more than just cultural representation. This is a genre that is being used and has been used to do real policy. And that's horrifying if you think about it. Yes?
Is that also new?
No, it's not new. Same, James Bond and MI6, there's a relationship there, not only in how they recruit, come live like this, but in terms of, in the War on Terror, that is an extreme example, but not an uncommon one, particularly with Jack Bauer. And why he becomes the focal point is pretty interesting. But the fact that you have to have the military go tell Hollywood to please stop, and they didn't, because it's all about ratings, was pretty eye-opening. So the book that I focus on, first of all, a little about le Carrès. His name was David Cornwell. He worked briefly for MI5 and MI6 before writing professionally in 1963 with the publication of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, the most celebrated, most popular spy novel ever written. And he was always sort of seen as the Cold War author until the Cold War ended and everyone said that his day is done. And then he continued to be very successful in the decade between the Cold War and 9/11, and then everyone said, what could he possibly say about 9/11? And he went on to do just as valid material. But 6 days after 9/11, he wrote a very, very prescient editorial on British newspapers called "We Have Already Lost the War on Terrorism," and he highlighted the reflexive military response, didn't have much faith at all in Bush, and it was, and you read it now, and it's like he just saw it all before it ever happened. He said they're going to use every excuse to go into Iraq. He said that in September 17th they're going to go all here and there, and then he will become more angry and more strident, even in public and in his writing, with the build-up to the war in Iraq. He will say in another editorial, 2003, the lies have been distributed are so many and so persistent that arguably fiction is the only way to tell the truth. Another reason why I'm attracted to the topic. And then he'll write, right before the release of Absolute Friends, I am now so angry, le Carré wrote a confidant, that I have to exercise a good deal of restraint in order to produce a readable book. And if I have the time, I'll talk about the reception of the book. There are quite a few people who say this isn't a readable book because it is very angry. And to me, that's what's interesting about it. I don't think it's his greatest book, maybe not even be in his top 10, but I chose it because it's the one he was writing before 9/11, and then I went to the archive to see how his mind worked after 9/11. He started it the summer of 2001 and finished it in March of 2003, the very month that we invaded Iraq. So I thought, I guess the thing I would do is read at least a plot summary to help contextualize some of the things I found in the archives. Absolute Friends has many of the elements one associates with le Carré's novels, such as individuals versus institutions and the complicated internal lives of double agents. But there is no doubting, as he called it, the rage of age, Alterszorn in German, left its mark on his first post-9/11 novel. The story revolves around the lifelong relationship between Ted Mundy, the son of a British military officer with an itinerant upbringing who settles for an uninspiring civil service career, and Sasha, a charismatic West German intellectual and anarchist who defects to East Germany only to become disillusioned with the oppressive regime. As a Stasi officer, Sasha enlists Ted to pass secrets to British intelligence. When the wall comes down, thanks in part to Ted and Sasha's efforts, Ted abandons the secret world and Britain for a more bohemian life in Germany. Ted takes a job as a tour guide in Munich and forms a makeshift family with a Turkish refugee and her son, essentially creating a life as far removed from the one he led in England as possible. After years of silence, Sasha contacts Ted after 9/11 and hopes the two can rekindle their relationship and make the world right again. Ted is a thinly veiled avatar for le Carré, as most of his protagonists are, manifesting the same outrage the author communicated in his editorials, and this is a great example of that. It's a description of Ted Mundy. It's a discovery in his 6th decade that half a century after the death of empire, the dismally ill-managed country he'd done a little of this and that for is being marched off to quell the natives on the strength of a bunch of lies in order to please a renegade hyperpower that thinks it can treat the rest of the world as its feet. Sasha is seduced by the vision of a mysterious oligarch named Dmitri to create a socialist think tank, what amounts to a library filled with left-wing literature and philosophy to counter American propaganda. And he convinces Ted to join him on this one last crusade against injustice. Teddy, my friend, we are partners in an historic enterprise, Sasha pleads. We shall do nothing to harm, nothing to destroy. Everything we dreamed of in Berlin has been delivered to us by Providence. We shall stem the advance of ignorance and perform a service of enlightenment for all humanity. Trained le Carré readers know that this is all too good to be true. Sasha is an easy mark, an idealist despite a lifetime of disappointment. But Ted is naturally more cynical. Dmitri is speaking their language, however, pushing all the right buttons for two world-weary radicals incensed by the state of the world. Ted is alarmed to learn that Sasha's former CIA contact is behind Dmitri and the library scheme. Another red flag involves some money originating from the Middle East. Ted realizes too late that supposed book deliveries are actually bomb-making materials meant to implicate the fledgling charity. When Ted reaches out to Nick Amory, an MI6 contact from his previous life for help, the CIA, aided by a compliant German police, springs the trap and guns down the two friends in what the press later sensationalizes as the Siege of Heidelberg. The world will come to know Ted and Sasha as al-Qaeda sympathizers, one with a Muslim girlfriend and a grudge against the West, and the other a radical leftist and former Stasi agent. Nick is left to pick up the pieces, writing an anonymous account of the massacre, identifying the extra-legal CIA action as a new Reichstag fire, perpetrated by, quote, agents of a self-elected junta of Washington neoconservative theologians close to the presidential throne, end quote. Predictably, no one of consequence notices or cares about Nick's truth. The West falls into line behind the next phase of America's neoconservative crusade. So that's the background of what the novel became by March 2003. But what I did with my summer research grant, courtesy of the university, in this July, was go visit the Bodleian Archives, the famous old library, many libraries at Oxford, because as an Oxford student, it's one of the few British institutions le Carrès loved, and he donated his manuscripts from, as you see there, 1965 to 2010 to the library, and it's kind of hard to get access to. I'm still not quite sure of what I'm allowed to produce, what I'm allowed to quote. That's going to be hard. But he has, literally tens of thousands of pages for every novel, and that makes me realize how hard of a worker he really was. And there are 39 boxes for this book, and I was able to, really doing nothing else, didn't see much of Oxford, 9 hours a day, go through all those boxes for a week. So what I found interesting, one, is that there were no drafts at all between September 11th and early November 2001. He lists every draft by date, and they're almost every day there's something. And then September 10th, there's a draft, nothing till early November. He was processing, like we all were. And so immediately the post 9/11 draft starts to include lots of Americans and CIA people debriefing Ted Bundy. All the plot seems to be like they're totally focused on the next attack. And over time, these plot points kind of disappear, and it gets to what we see in the final version. But I wanted to highlight, because I'm fascinated by how he wrote, and I found the very first time he talks about 9/11 in the book, it's almost never mentioned in the final product. That's what's fascinating. It's all he could think about during these drafts, but all this kind of disappears. So this is his handwriting, where and I'll read it for you, what essentially is in blue there, where somebody, presumably a CIA person, is interviewing Ted Bundy. So I'll start with the dialogue at the top. What's all this got to do with Sasha? Everything. How did you feel when the Twin Towers came down? Sick, Bundy retorted from behind his hand. You didn't throw your hat in the air, even a tiny little way? No schadenfreude, not a twinge, not a feeling of they had it coming to them? Never. I don't believe you. Didn't say it, didn't think it, didn't feel it. The hand had come down at last, leaving his face undefended. Did you write it? Who the hell would I write it to? And that's kind of the very first mention of 9/11, and then it'll be a little more developed, and really developed. The guy threw away dozens of books in the process of these months. So by the time he gets to late 2002, early 2002 even, when it's clear that the build-up to the Iraq War is taking over what is happening in Afghanistan, he's getting angrier. More egregious kind of to him is that war as opposed to anything else. So here's another attempt to address 9/11, and again, this is how he has a dated draft. It's January 20th, 2002, and one of the things that kind of impresses me is how clunky his writing is, because it makes me feel like, gee, even he had these really kind of bad drafts. So one of the things, he has this part here. He goes, this Nick Omri, who winds up being a kind of decent character from MI6, he's talking to Ted. He goes, they've had a little difficulty, Omri went on to Mundy. He goes, perhaps you've read about it. They're hopping mad. They've screwed up, he puts on the side. They've screwed up and they're defending civilization. That includes us. Either we're for them or against them. If you're against them, now's the time to make a run for it because believe me, this is no Sunday school. To me, that's bad writing. That's not le Carré you would see, later. But it's like, look at his process. He's just all over the place. And, he's trying to think it out. Some other things I found, just so I could leave time for us to talk it over, is this was a really unexpected find in the papers, a draft editorial for what I don't know if it's still around, called Democracy Now!, but it's kind of created to be kind of anti-war on terror, very much worried about the Patriot Act and that sort of thing. And this is a man who's not a total recluse, but he doesn't put himself out there a great deal in media. He didn't. But he went on television here to talk to this basically bunch of radical leftist Americans mostly to go after what he saw was coming in Iraq. And this editorial is really, really blistering, and it shows up in the novel as well. So he really was up on Bush's sort of missionary fervor, and it was very much a religious view of us versus them and crusade and that type of language. And so here he goes, the religious cant that will send American troops into battle is perhaps the most sickening aspect of this surreal war to be. Bush has an arm lock on God, and God has very particular political opinions. God appointed America to save the world in any way that suits America. God appointed Israel to be the nexus of American Middle Eastern policy, and anyone who wants to mess with that idea is A, anti-Semitic, B, anti-American, and C, with the enemy, and D, a terrorist. He's angry. He's an angry, and it shows up in his writing. Another thing I found that was really fascinating, because it's not in the book, is an afterword. This never showed up in the book, and I think you look at the date, it's July 9th, 2003, mission accomplished had already happened, May 2003, and no WMD was found, and that's kind of the point of the afterword. He's very specific about, as of this date, none of this has happened, going off on Tony Blair, going off on, obviously, Bush, but it never made it. And either, he could tell the publishers what to do, but my theory is that he worried that the worst possible thing would be that they found the WMD while the book was being published, it's like, oh, I guess that would be embarrassing. But it's weird, because it's not there, but I was very happy to see it. For us as researchers and writers, I was fascinated that even this guy has to deal with reader number 2, I mean, this is a guy, by 2003, he is king of the world, he's the wealthiest, most famous spy novelist in history, and here he is having to send a draft out. I think, he wanted to. I think it helps him, makes him be a better writer. But notice the title is not Absent Friends, it's The Siege of Heidelberg. And he realized, if I put that in there, people are going to kind of know what happens in the book, so he changes the title. But I love this, and he's explaining how he works. I've always preferred to write that, like he does the story. I've always preferred to write this way. First make the story work, then to relive it on the ground. And he does, he travels, when he wrote about Cambodia, he went to Cambodia, he went to Congo. I mean, after he writes a book, he writes about that. And I found that really, that's like please be kind sort of thing. Like, wow, this guy has to go through a process. And so I think that's just fascinating to me that he had to put up with that. Not that I would want to have time to talk about the reception of the book, but basically people were taken aback by how strident it was, including The Nation and The Guardian were, you can expect, to be positive toward le Carré, but the New York Times is like, he's the anti-Americanism, he thinks we're doing the wrong thing. It's when the New York Times is solidly behind the Bush administration and they're attacking le Carré for daring to question anything, and it's kind of interesting cultural moment. But in an interview, I like this, he said, he found it deeply depressing that the West had moved so quickly from the Cold War to a new era of unlimited wars in the future. And I suppose that's what I was fighting against in Absolute Friends. That for as long as I can is what I will continue to fight against. I would long for more comprehension and a greater respect for the victims of our dreams. I love that because when I look back on his earlier interviews and writings, I found almost the same kind of quote in 1963, because I want us to talk about, he resented being known as a spy novelist. He saw himself as a novelist who just used to be a spy and used spy world to talk about human nature. Graham Greene got that credit, why can't I? Yeah. And so he said the same thing, like with the Cold War, what we are doing in the name of this is violating our professed values. And when we dream up terror, there are real victims behind it that we can't always see. And finally, just because one of the last things he wrote publicly before he died was, of course, he will write about the Trump years. But of course he did. He was more horrified because he expected it in us. He never really had a high opinion of most Americans or ever since Bush, he's like, you guys, I don't know what to do. But he was worried, he was horrified by Brexit, as you can imagine, horrified. And he was horrified that Trumpism had crossed the Atlantic in many ways. And this quote to me is just so sad and so him, though, and it's what I try to push off in my thinking all the time, but I do. We seem to be joined by nothing very much except fear and bewilderment about what the future holds. We have no coherent ideology in the West, and we used to believe in the great American example. I think that's recently been profoundly undermined for us. We're alone. And he will, in a way, have that perspective throughout his career. That's why he's seen as the anti-James Bond. He writes what it's really like, and the human dimension and the human cost of what is a game much of the time versus the gadgets and the other things that diminish the seriousness of it. Well, I wanted to stop there just so we could talk. Any thoughts you have? Like I said, it's a work in progress, so if there's a kind of anything you want to help clarify for you, I'm always happy. That'll help me.
Do you know if it's from Oxford, so it has a background in classics as well?
Yeah, in fact, he very much does. He actually taught at Eton, the infamous, as he calls it, really, it was kind of a bad experience for him, but that's what he taught. He knows Greek, he taught Greek and Latin and German. He was definitely a master of languages. And so, yeah, he very much was in that world. And I probably am not smart enough myself to know how often those allusions show up in the books. But
what I caught on is the ending of The Two Friends and how it was received as kind of like, oh, well, they must have been killed because of this.
Right.
And it's very similar to Laocoon, who he was a guy who told all the Trojans, hey, don't bring the Trojan horse in because there's something fishy going on.
Wow.
Decided they wanted to find out, so he sends a snake to kill him and his two sons, and all of the Trojans read that as like, oh, he must have angered to God, we're going to bring the Trojan horse in. And it was very reminiscent of that to me.
Yeah, the whole reception of what winds up being bomb materials is a Trojan horse. It's like, this is great stuff, and then it's all an excuse for them to be totally wiped out. That's great. Yeah. Thank you. I think that. Nikki?
This is another horrific example of media being used in real life torture. But I read in the 1990s during the Serbian War that Serbians were picking up women and basically using, they had been watching violent porn
Right.
and used that to torture women in the methods that they saw on the screen.
And we know that Al-Qaeda would watch films like Black Hawk Down to learn how to better fight us because it showed asymmetric warfare, like how do you take on a stronger enemy. So that's why I think this genre is more than just, let's look at how a TV show reflects things, but the shows, the books are creating a reality because of these horrific examples. And yeah, that's a great, not great, but very truthful, another example of that. Sabita.
Two comments/questions. One, I know your emphasis is on le Carrès, but you're also taking it to a spontaneous section. So Carrie Madison, I mean, that's a complete departure from all the protagonists, and le Carrès as well, so all male.
Yes.
So,
except for Little Drummer Girl, and that one, people rightfully so, because you're not getting it. Yeah.
so that is my first question: is how and why do you think that's taking place in pop culture?
Yeah.
And the second one, I just happened to notice the sleuth in me in the afterword that you had given us. I think.
Right.
And there, le Carrès writes about when he completes his work on July 9, 2003.
Right.
And it seemed to me that that's a very American way of writing the date. Because,
so that's true. Yeah.
Because I was trained to put in the day first by the month. And then now, of course, after living there for 30 years, I've got used to it. But it struck me that why not?
In the text, but of course he dates his draft in the British,
Oh, yeah.
And that always confused, because as long as it was there, I'm like, I kept reading the date wrong. Like, oh my God. But yeah, I think there, it is interesting that he's using, whether he liked it or not, his largest audience was American. The publisher certainly would put that out there. But the point about, I do have a whole, almost half of a chapter on the Maya from Zero Dark 30 and Carrie Mathison, because they're the same character. And they're also, by the way, reflecting real life characters, the women who were part of the Bin Laden unit. Maya, Jessica Chastain's character, is one woman, but she's representing like 5 women who actually were behind the hunt for Bin Laden, and narratively that's how you're going to do it. But also Claire Danes, whose roommate, by the way, in Yale became a CIA officer, and she met her when she was, again, after many years, to learn about the CIA for this role. Also was mentored by the real-life Maya. Every year she would go back, they would have a camp at the CIA to talk about plot points and what's happening and how does things work. But a lot of great analysis, not mine, that I'm quoting, showed that the increase in women protagonists in these types of spy productions, whether it's fiction like novels or film, is also they're also deeply troubled. Like, we know Carrie Mathison is bipolar, and she's an easy avatar for like America is bipolar and mentally ill, but also hyper aggressive and all these other things. And they notice that women and protagonists are supposed to embody the national identity in a way that they don't expect of some of the male protagonists. And what is it about that? There's a whole bunch of work on disability studies, and you can find authors who in that field who love Carrie Mathison because it's a somewhat honest look at bipolar disorder, and others who say this is horrifying, and I don't know quite who to believe, but I'm quoting them both. So yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with it's still using some gendered tropes about women in these male spaces, but also attempts to kind of break those molds too. And I think Carrie Mathison is an uneven version of that. But I think they do address that in the book. But yeah, le Carrès himself is not. He'll be the first to say, I don't know women. And I at least like the fact that he does. I embrace that he doesn't try, and when he did and failed, he doesn't do it again. Although he modeled the character in Little Drummer Girl after his sister, who was an actress, radical as well. Yes, Allison.
So I'm interested in your thoughts on his process, in those 29 boxes or however many there were. How much of it was handwritten versus typed?
Yeah, it was fascinating to me because, he would do this sort of, he would every day, by the way, this is another example of male authors doing what they always did, which is have their wives do a lot of work. He co-wrote with his wife. His wife is all over this. Her hand, I noticed her handwriting, and they would write to each other in the margins, and she would presumably be typing up his handwriting. I don't know that, but that's how I think men of his generation would expect it. He is profusely thankful for in ways that other male authors are not. But it's definitely a process where she's there all the time, and he would write up that sort of stuff, write like this, and then the next day it would show up like that, and then he would write all over it again, and then the new draft would be clean. And so it was helpful to me, because if I didn't quite read the handwriting, I could guarantee that the next days I would find it. It took me a while to figure that out, but the amount of work, I mean, I used to think, oh God, writers have this, they can go to a coffee shop and hang out. This guy is exhausting, man. It's exhausting to think about how much he did. Tens of thousands of pages for what amounted to 280 pages, and maybe that's why. It's great.
Do you have any sense that he was working on one book, more than one book at a time?
No, he never did that. Never. I mean, he would do things like that editorial. I mean, he felt very politically active in a way he wasn't before 9/11. So he would take time to do these sort of editorials and things. But you don't find him doing that very often, unless it's around book publicity with those earlier kind of, like the Russia House. He talked about what happened with the fall of communism and all that. But it's only because the book is coming out type of thing. Here he was really, like, he went to a protest. He never went to a protest before he got arrested in Trafalgar Square.
Wow.
Cops beat him up a little bit.
Thank you.
Yes, Nikki.
Do you have any sense, I'm trying to think about the popularity of spy fiction, whether it be written fiction or the TV or the movies, how the growth and the popularity coincides with like Netflix and digital TV and shifts in the entertainment industry as an industry?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Other than, like, there's a whole great new sort of field, I guess maybe not so new, but like reception studies where you can measure those things better because we have the tools to do it. And I need to do that for myself to make this just more legitimate because I think there is an explosion of it. Because if we just look at how many foreign language spy stuff there's Israeli shows, there's Spanish shows, there's a great, that show Tehran is like, there's a lot from Middle Eastern production companies where you didn't see that before. I think now it's the audience is so splintered, whereas in the network days, 24 was everything, Alias, and then those before all this streaming stuff, there were huge audiences, but very limited, jaded look at things. Now, it's Le Carré world. It's all human tragedy and error, and you don't find any of the kind of rah-rah stuff very much, except for like FBI. The network shows there's like 5 FBIs, there's SEAL Team 6 or whatever. There's those, however, are not the ones that are winning audiences. It's more of this sort of complicated, darker stuff. But yeah, it's a good question. I need to do that to get those numbers. Well, we have time for one more, but I'll have to teach. Yeah.
Can you go back to your last slide?
Yeah.
So this reads very existential to me.
Yeah.
And you were talking about it in the context of Brexit. So do you think that this sentiment is expressing like a dual idea about UK being isolated, but also like his own existential crisis? And if that's true, does he have this like estrangement and sort of lack of meaning as a theme for his characters?
It's a great question. He does and he doesn't, because with Absolute Friends, it was reviewers, even those who wanted to indulge in the anti-American stuff, was like, this is so despairing. There's no hope in it. And usually, even in the end of Spy Who Came In From the Cold, the character, it's a tragic ending, but he is trying to rescue his lover to get him across the wall with him. She falls, is shot behind on the wall, and he decides, to go back down and die with her. And it was a horrible ending, but it was him on his own terms choosing the way he's going to go out. That was seen as like existential, but with this message, his early 9/11 novels are very just, there's no hope. No matter what you try to do, this world will chew you up. And he gets away from that toward the end, but with the Brexit and the Trump novels, the last couple he did, it goes back to that, what is there left to do but kind of comment on, try to find, his message is, this world that we live in, and whether it's the protagonist is a spy or is forced to be one, or it's usually an accidental spy, finding a little bit of happiness, carving out a little bit of love and connection is the only victory you can take from things. And so he does try to have his characters do that. But I think he was profoundly just wiped out by the last years of his life, the things that were going on, like we all were, that I'm very sad. When he died, I almost felt like it was from a broken heart, He was 89, and he had a bunch of things, but it seemed like he was done. And I think this last quote, one of the last quotes you have, tells you that. Well, I have to get to class. You probably have to get to class. But I appreciate it. It's really helpful, which is what I wanted.